7 words changed everything in a crowded tenement on Hester Street. On March 15, 1881, during a routine health inspection in Manhattan's Lower East Side, 7-year-old Seamus O'Sullivan spoke for the first time in his life. His words weren't the typical first utterances of a delayed child asking for water or calling for his mother. Instead, in front of 3 city health officials and a dozen witnesses, the boy pointed a trembling finger at his mother and declared in perfect, chilling clarity, "She hides 7 dead men in our house." The silence that followed those words would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. What investigators discovered in the O'Sullivan boarding house would expose a horror so methodical, so calculated, that it challenged everything the immigrant community thought they knew about survival in America. Before we continue with the story of Bridget O'Sullivan and the boy who never spoke, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more dark historical mysteries. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience from around the world. The events that unfolded that March day didn't begin with a child's accusation, but rather with a mother's desperation and a community's willingness to look the other way. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1881 was a symphony of desperation played in 20 different languages. Irish, German, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants packed into tenements that were never designed to house so many souls. The neighborhood reeked of unwashed bodies, coal smoke, and the underlying stench of open sewers that ran beneath the crowded streets. Disease moved through these buildings like wildfire, claiming lives with ruthless efficiency. Bridget O'Sullivan had arrived from County Cork 3 years earlier, carrying nothing but her silent son and the weight of promises made to relatives still starving in Ireland. Her husband, Declan, had died during the Atlantic crossing, succumbing to typhus in the ship's cramped hold. The widow found herself alone in America with a child who hadn't spoken since witnessing his father's death, and a burning obligation to send money back to family members who depended on her success in the new world. The 3-story brownstone at 47 Hester Street had seen better days before the Civil War, but by 1881, it served as a boarding house for newly arrived immigrants. Bridget managed to lease the building from an absentee landlord who cared more about collecting rent than maintaining the property. She converted every available space into sleeping quarters, cramming up to 4 beds into rooms originally designed for 1. The basement housed the most desperate cases, men who paid 50 cents a week to sleep on straw mattresses surrounded by the building's furnace and the constant dripping of condensation. Seamus O'Sullivan was a peculiar child by anyone's standards. Neighbors whispered that he was touched, blessed, or cursed, depending on their superstitions. He never cried, never laughed, and never spoke. Instead, he observed everything with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the world around him. His mother kept him close, claiming he was delicate, but those who watched carefully noticed the boy's uncanny ability to appear and disappear without making a sound. He moved through the boarding house like a ghost, present one moment and gone the next. Bridget herself was a woman transformed by necessity. Those who knew her in Ireland remembered a gentle soul who sang lullabies and helped birth babies. America had carved away her softness, leaving behind a pragmatic survivor who calculated every human interaction in terms of profit and loss. She spoke English with careful precision, having recognized early that her thick Cork accent would limit her opportunities. Her appearance was always neat, despite their poverty. She understood that respectability was a commodity she couldn't afford to lose. The boarding house catered to a specific type of immigrant, men traveling alone, carrying what little wealth they possessed in hidden pockets and sewn-in pouches. These were individuals who had sold everything they owned for passage to America, who had no family waiting for them, and who often arrived sick from the journey. They were perfect tenants for Bridget's purposes because when they disappeared, few people noticed or cared enough to investigate. The neighborhood itself was a perfect cover for such activities. Death was so common that the city had established multiple morgues just to handle the overflow. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, and simple starvation claimed lives daily. When immigrants failed to write letters home or didn't show up for promised meetings, their absence was usually attributed to the harsh realities of urban survival rather than foul play. The first death in Bridget's boarding house occurred in November of 1879, just 6 months after she took over the property. Paddy Flanagan, a 43-year-old farmer from Galway, arrived at her doorstep with a fever that had been building during his 3-week journey. He carried with him nearly $60 in gold coins, a fortune for a man of his background, saved from years of selling livestock to pay for his passage and establish himself in America. Flanagan took a bed in the basement, too sick to climb stairs but determined to recover quickly. He spoke often of his plans to buy farmland in Pennsylvania, showing anyone who would listen the carefully wrapped coins that represented his future. Bridget attended to his needs personally, bringing him soup and medicine, earning his trust and gratitude. On his 4th night in the boarding house, Flanagan's fever broke, and he began making plans to leave. He spoke excitedly about visiting the Immigration Services office and finding transportation west. That evening, Bridget brought him what she called a special tea, a remedy her grandmother had used in Ireland for strengthening men after illness. Seamus watched from the shadows of the basement stairs as his mother administered the drink. The boy had developed an habit of observing without being seen, his small size and absolute silence, making him nearly invisible. He saw Flanagan drink the entire cup gratefully, praising Bridget's kindness and promising to write letters recommending her boarding house to other Irish immigrants. Within 2 hours, Flanagan was convulsing. His body twisted in ways that suggested horrific internal pain, but no sound escaped his lips. His eyes bulged as he clawed at his throat, as if trying to remove some invisible obstruction. The other men in the basement gathered around, but none of them had medical knowledge. They assumed the fever had returned with a vengeance, a common occurrence that often claimed men just when they seemed to be recovering. Bridget arrived within minutes of the commotion, carrying clean sheets and wearing an expression of practiced concern. She knelt beside Flanagan's bed, took his hand, and whispered what appeared to be prayers in Irish Gaelic. To the watching men, she seemed like an angel of mercy, comforting a dying stranger in his final moments. Only Seamus, crouched unseen in the darkness, observed the brief moment when his mother's fingers deftly slipped into Flanagan's coat pocket, removing the small leather pouch that contained his life savings. Paddy Flanagan died before sunrise. Bridget immediately took charge of the situation, explaining to the other tenants that such deaths were tragically common among immigrants who arrived already weakened by the journey. She volunteered to handle all arrangements, citing her experience with death and her connections in the Irish community. The city's overwhelmed death registry accepted her explanation without question, listing the cause as consumption complicated by malnutrition. What the registry didn't record was Flanagan's burial location. Bridget told the other tenants that she had arranged for him to be interred in Calvary Cemetery in Queens, a common destination for Irish Catholic immigrants. In reality, she had made very different arrangements for Paddy Flanagan's remains. Late that night, with Seamus supposedly sleeping upstairs, Bridget dragged Flanagan's body to the building's sub-basement, a space that had once served as cold storage for the building's previous incarnation as a private residence. The room was accessible only through a narrow door, hidden behind the furnace, invisible to casual observation. She had discovered this space during her first week in the building and immediately recognized its potential. The sub-basement was naturally cool and dry, with stone walls that muffled sound and a ventilation system that prevented the accumulation of odors. Most importantly, it was completely separate from the areas where tenants lived, making discovery unlikely. Bridget had prepared the space carefully, lining the walls with quicklime she had purchased from a construction supplier, claiming she needed it for building repairs. As she wrapped Flanagan's body in sheets and quicklime, Bridget felt no remorse. In her mind, she had simply accelerated an inevitable death while ensuring that his money would serve a purpose. Flanagan had been dying anyway, she told herself. The fever would have taken him within days or weeks. His gold coins, rather than disappearing into the American economy or being stolen by strangers, would now serve to keep her and Seamus alive while supporting her family in Ireland. From the basement stairs, young Seamus watched his mother work. His 7-year-old mind couldn't fully comprehend what he was witnessing, but his instincts told him that something fundamentally wrong was happening. The trauma of seeing his father die, combined with this new horror, drove his silence deeper. He would not speak of what he saw because he couldn't form the words to describe it. The success of Bridget's first murder established a pattern that would repeat 6 more times over the following 16 months. Each death followed a similar template. A sick immigrant arriving with visible wealth, Bridget's personal care and attention, a sudden deterioration after consuming her special remedies, and a quiet death that attracted no official scrutiny. The second victim was Klaus Weber, a German clockmaker who arrived in January of 1880. Weber carried his life savings sewn into the lining of his coat, nearly $80 accumulated over 20 years of careful work. He suffered from a persistent cough that worsened in the cold New York air, making him an ideal target for Bridget's ministrations. She told other tenants that Weber had died of pneumonia, a believable explanation given the harsh winter conditions. Heinrich Müller followed in March, a Bavarian carpenter with $45 in gold pieces and a fever that had started during his Atlantic crossing. His death certificate listed consumption as the cause, and no one questioned why his expensive woodworking tools disappeared along with his body. The fourth victim presented a greater challenge. Antonio Benedetto, an Italian stoneworker, was healthier than Bridget's previous targets, but he made the mistake of displaying his wealth too openly. He had nearly $100 hidden in various pockets, money earned from selling his family's vineyard before immigrating. Benedetto was suspicious by nature and initially refused Bridget's offered remedies when he developed a mild stomach ailment. Bridget adapted her approach, enlisting the help of other Italian tenants to convince Benedetto that her medicines were effective. She waited until he was desperately ill from what appeared to be severe food poisoning before offering her special tea as a last resort. The irony was lost on everyone except Seamus, who had watched his mother contaminate Benedetto's food with the same substances she later claimed could cure him. By the summer of 1880, Bridget had refined her methods considerably. She had established relationships with 3 different undertakers, rotating between them to avoid suspicion. She told each one that she represented a charitable organization helping poor immigrants arrange burials, paying them small fees to handle bodies without asking too many questions. The undertakers assumed the bodies were being interred in potters' fields or donated to medical schools, both common practices for unclaimed immigrants. Seamus's silence deepened with each death he witnessed. The boy had developed an elaborate system of hiding places throughout the boarding house, spaces where he could observe without being detected. He watched his mother's interactions with the tenants, learning to predict which men would become her next targets. His child's mind began creating categories: the safe men who had no money or family nearby, and the dangerous men who showed wealth while appearing vulnerable to illness. The neighborhood around them was changing rapidly as well. The city government, pressured by reform movements and concerned about epidemic diseases, had begun implementing more systematic health inspections. The New York City Board of Health, established only a few years earlier, was expanding its oversight of tenement buildings, particularly those housing large numbers of immigrants. Bridget initially viewed these developments with concern, but she quickly realized that the increased official attention could work to her advantage. Health inspectors were primarily concerned with sanitation and disease prevention, not with investigating individual deaths that had already been properly certified. If anything, the official presence legitimized her position as a responsible landlord who cooperated fully with government authorities. She began maintaining meticulous records of her tenants, documenting their arrivals, illnesses, and deaths with bureaucratic precision. These records, which she voluntarily shared with health officials, portrayed her as a responsible member of the community who dealt with tragic but inevitable circumstances. The documentation became a shield that protected her from suspicion while providing detailed intelligence about potential victims. The psychological toll on Seamus, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly apparent to those who bothered to observe him. Neighbors noted that the boy seemed to age rapidly, his eyes developing a haunted quality that was disturbing in someone so young. He began exhibiting compulsive behaviors, arranging objects in precise patterns, checking and rechecking locks and windows, and spending hours staring at walls as if seeing through them. Dr. James Kellerman, a German physician who occasionally treated tenants in the building, became concerned about Seamus's development. During a house call in September of 1880, he observed the boy for several minutes and noted behaviors consistent with severe trauma. Kellerman suggested to Bridget that the child might benefit from specialized care, mentioning new treatments being developed for children who had experienced significant emotional shock. Bridget politely declined the doctor's suggestions, explaining that Seamus was simply a quiet child who would grow out of his shyness. Privately, she recognized that any medical attention directed toward her son could potentially lead to uncomfortable questions about their living situation. She began limiting Seamus's interactions with outsiders, claiming that crowds and strangers made him nervous. The fifth and sixth murders, committed within 2 weeks of each other in October of 1880, marked a dangerous escalation in Bridget's activities. James Crawford, a Scottish textile worker, and Eric Lindqvist, a Swedish labourer, both died under circumstances that began to attract subtle attention from other tenants. Crawford had been particularly healthy upon his arrival, showing no signs of illness despite the harsh autumn weather. He carried nearly $70 in American currency, money he had earned working in textile mills in Massachusetts before deciding to try his luck in New York. His sudden illness and death surprised other Scottish immigrants in the neighborhood who had planned to help him find work through their established networks. Lindqvist's death was even more suspicious to those who knew him well. The Swedish immigrant was known for his robust health and skeptical nature. He had initially refused all of Bridget's offers of food and medicine, preferring to purchase his own supplies from vendors he trusted. Only when he developed severe abdominal pain, accompanied by vomiting and diarrhea, did he finally accept her help. He died within hours of consuming her remedy. Thomas Mackenzie, a Scottish stoneworker who had befriended both men, began asking uncomfortable questions about the frequency of deaths in Bridget's boarding house. Mackenzie had worked in quarries and construction sites throughout Scotland and America, places where men regularly died from accidents and disease, but he had never seen death rates comparable to those at 47 Hester Street. Mackenzie started keeping his own informal records, noting that 7 men had died in the boarding house over the past year, while similar buildings in the neighborhood typically experienced 1 or 2 deaths annually. He also observed that the men who died seemed to share certain characteristics. They were traveling alone, carried visible wealth, and had no established connections in New York that would lead to investigations if they disappeared. Bridget became aware of Mackenzie's suspicions through careful eavesdropping and observation. She recognized that he represented a significant threat to her activities, but she also realized that eliminating him would likely attract the kind of attention she had successfully avoided thus far. Mackenzie was well connected in the Scottish immigrant community, had friends who would investigate his disappearance, and possessed the kind of robust health that would make a sudden illness appear suspicious. Instead of targeting Mackenzie directly, Bridget began a subtle campaign to undermine his credibility. She spoke privately with other tenants about Mackenzie's drinking habits, his tendency toward conspiracy theories, and his resentment toward Irish immigrants. She suggested that his suspicions were motivated by ethnic prejudice rather than legitimate concerns about safety. The strategy proved effective. Other tenants began dismissing Mackenzie's warnings as the paranoid ravings of a man who drank too much and resented sharing living space with people from other countries. When Mackenzie approached the local police with his concerns, the desk sergeant treated his complaints as a minor landlord-tenant dispute rather than a serious criminal allegation. Meanwhile, Seamus was developing increasingly sophisticated methods of observation and concealment. The boy had discovered that the building's original architects had included several hidden passages and storage areas that were invisible to casual inspection. He created a network of hideaways that allowed him to monitor almost every room without being detected. From these hidden vantages, Seamus watched his mother's interactions with increasing understanding. His 7-year-old mind was beginning to grasp the patterns behind the deaths, even if he couldn't articulate the full scope of what he was witnessing. He began categorizing the tenants according to danger levels his mother seemed to assign them, learning to predict which men would receive her special attention. The boy also started observing his mother's nighttime activities more systematically. He watched her make regular visits to the sub-basement, carrying bundles and returning empty-handed. He noted the strong chemical smells that occasionally emanated from the hidden room, scents that reminded him of the slaughterhouses and tanneries that operated throughout the Lower East Side. Seamus's understanding of his mother's activities created a psychological burden that manifested in increasingly severe symptoms. He developed chronic insomnia, spending entire nights in his hiding places rather than sleeping in his bed. He began experiencing physical reactions to stress, trembling hands, racing heartbeat, and episodes of shallow breathing that sometimes left him dizzy and disoriented. The approaching winter of 1880 brought new challenges for Bridget's operations. The city's health department had announced plans for comprehensive inspections of all tenement buildings, focusing on sanitation, ventilation, and overcrowding. These inspections would be more thorough than previous efforts, including examination of basement and sub-basement areas that had previously been ignored. Bridget realized that her sub-basement storage system would not survive detailed official scrutiny. She began making plans to relocate her victims' remains, but the logistics presented enormous challenges. Moving 7 bodies without detection would require careful timing and assistance, resources that were difficult to obtain without exposing her activities to potential accomplices. She considered several options: burning the bodies in the building's furnace, dissolving them in acid, or transporting them to remote locations for burial. Each approach presented distinct risks and technical challenges that could lead to discovery and arrest. As she weighed these options, Bridget failed to notice that Seamus was observing her planning process with increasing clarity and comprehension. The 7th and final murder committed by Bridget O'Sullivan would prove to be her undoing, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Michael Donovan, a 48-year-old farmer from County Mayo, arrived at the boarding house in February of 1881, carrying the largest sum of money Bridget had yet encountered, nearly $150 in gold coins and currency. Donovan was different from her previous victims in several crucial ways. He was healthier, more suspicious, and had established connections in the Irish community that would notice his disappearance. He had also made arrangements to meet with relatives in Boston within 2 weeks of his arrival in New York, creating a timeline that would trigger investigations if he failed to appear. Bridget recognized these risk factors, but found herself unable to resist the temptation of Donovan's wealth. The money represented more than she typically accumulated in 6 months of normal boarding house operations. With proper investment, it could secure her and Seamus's future, while allowing her to send substantial support to her family in Ireland. She began planning Donovan's death with unusual care, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to create plausible deniability. The opportunity came when several other tenants developed minor respiratory illnesses, creating an atmosphere of sickness that would make one more death seem unsurprising. Donovan initially resisted Bridget's offers of treatment, citing his natural mistrust of remedies and his robust constitution. However, when he began experiencing symptoms that appeared consistent with the illnesses affecting other tenants, he eventually accepted her help, viewing her as a maternal figure who reminded him of his own mother back in Mayo. The critical difference this time was that Seamus had positioned himself to observe the murder more closely than ever before. Hidden in a concealed alcove behind the basement stairs, the boy watched his mother prepare and administer the poison that would kill Michael Donovan. For the first time, he saw the entire process. The careful measurement of substances, the methodical mixing, and the practiced deception as she presented the deadly concoction as medicine. Donovan's death was particularly violent, perhaps due to his strong constitution or the larger dose of poison Bridget administered to ensure effectiveness. He convulsed for nearly an hour, his body fighting desperately against the toxins. Throughout his agony, he maintained consciousness, his eyes showing full awareness of what was happening to him, even as his body betrayed him. Seamus watched the entire death, unable to move or make sound despite his horror. The boy's trauma reached a critical threshold as he observed Donovan's final moments. The man's eyes searching desperately for help, his hands reaching toward Bridget in supplication, and his silent mouth forming words that no one would ever hear. After Donovan's death, Bridget's behavior began showing signs of psychological deterioration that she had successfully hidden during her previous murders. The accumulated stress of maintaining her facade while committing systematic killing was beginning to affect her judgment and emotional control. She became more erratic in her interactions with tenants, alternating between excessive solicitude and barely controlled irritation. Several men noticed her tendency to stare at them for long periods, as if calculating something they couldn't understand. Her previously meticulous housekeeping began showing gaps. Dirty dishes accumulated, laundry went unwashed, and the building's common areas developed an atmosphere of neglect. Most significantly, Bridget began making mistakes in her record-keeping and storytelling. She told different versions of Donovan's death to different people, creating inconsistencies that careful observers began to notice. She claimed he had died of pneumonia to some tenants, while telling others he had succumbed to a heart condition. She told Mackenzie that Donovan had been buried in Calvary Cemetery, but informed a visiting priest that the burial had taken place in Woodlawn. Mackenzie, despite the campaign to discredit him, continued his informal investigation. He had begun corresponding with immigrants' rights organizations and Catholic charities, asking if they had records of the men who had allegedly died in Bridget's boarding house. The responses he received were troubling. None of the organizations had any records of burials matching the names and dates Bridget had provided. As winter gave way to spring, the promised health inspections moved closer to implementation. The New York City Board of Health announced that inspections would begin in March, starting with buildings that house the largest numbers of immigrants. The boarding house at 47 Hester Street was high on their priority list. Bridget realized that time was running out for her current operation. She began making frantic plans to relocate, but moving would require capital she had already committed to supporting her family in Ireland. She had sent most of her victims' money overseas, leaving herself with insufficient funds to establish a new identity and location. The psychological pressure on Seamus was reaching unbearable levels. The boy had now witnessed 7 murders, watched his mother dispose of 7 bodies, and lived with the knowledge that she was planning to continue killing. His child's mind was fragmenting under the weight of secrets he couldn't share and horrors he couldn't escape. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the O'Sullivan boarding house intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of a mother's deadly desperation and a son's traumatic silence. The breaking point was approaching for both mother and son, and when it came, it would arrive in the form of 3 city health inspectors conducting a routine examination of tenement conditions. March 15th, 1881, dawned cold and overcast, with a bitter wind that cut through the narrow streets of the Lower East Side. Dr. Samuel Hayes, Inspector Margaret Walsh, and Clerk Robert Chen arrived at 47 Hester Street at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, carrying clipboards, measuring tools, and the authority of the New York City Board of Health. Bridget had prepared for this inspection with desperate thoroughness. She had spent the previous week cleaning every visible surface. organizing tenant records and rehearsing explanations for any irregularities the inspectors might discover. She had also made arrangements to keep Seamus upstairs and out of sight, fearing that his strange behavior might attract unwanted attention. The inspection began routinely. Dr. Hayes examined the building's ventilation systems, while Inspector Walsh measured room dimensions and counted occupants. Clark Chen recorded their findings and asked standard questions about tenant turnover, death rates, and sanitation practices. Bridget answered every inquiry with practiced competence, presenting herself as a responsible landlord who took her duties seriously. Her performance was nearly flawless. She guided the inspectors through each room with confidence, explaining the building's layout and pointing out improvements she had made to comply with city regulations. Her tenant records were immaculate, documenting arrivals, departures, and deaths with bureaucratic precision. She even volunteered information about her charitable work, helping poor immigrants arrange proper burials, painting herself as a pillar of the community. Dr. Hayes was initially impressed by Bridget's organization and apparent dedication to her tenants' welfare. In his experience, most boarding house operators showed little concern for official regulations or tenant safety. Bridget O'Sullivan seemed genuinely committed to maintaining proper standards, even under difficult economic circumstances. Inspector Walsh focused on structural issues, measuring ceiling heights, examining window sizes, and calculating the number of occupants per room. The building met minimum legal requirements, though barely. The overcrowding was severe but not technically illegal, and Bridget had documentation showing that she turned away potential tenants when capacity limits were reached. Clark Chen's role was to document everything for official records, but he was also trained to notice inconsistencies that might indicate regulatory violations. As he recorded information about tenant deaths over the previous year, he began noting patterns that seemed unusual but not necessarily suspicious. The problems began when the inspection team reached the basement level. The space housed 8 men in conditions that, while crowded, met the minimum legal requirements for immigrant housing. However, Dr. Hayes noticed an unusual odor that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond the visible living areas. "There's a chemical smell down here," Hayes observed, looking around the basement with professional suspicion. "It reminds me of the preservatives we use in medical facilities. Are you storing any cleaning supplies or industrial materials?" Bridget explained that she used lime for pest control and moisture management, a common practice in basement spaces. Her explanation was plausible and initially satisfied the inspectors. But Dr. Hayes continued to detect underlying odors that seemed inconsistent with normal basement storage. The doctor's medical training had made him sensitive to the smell of death and decay, scents that could indicate unsanitary conditions or hidden health hazards. The basement carried an underlying aroma that reminded him of the morgues and medical facilities where he had studied anatomy during his education. It was subtle but persistent, the kind of smell that suggested organic matter in various stages of decomposition. "I'd like to examine the entire lower level," Hayes announced. "City regulations require us to inspect all areas that could affect tenant health, including storage spaces and utility areas." Bridget's carefully controlled facade began to crack. She explained that the basement contained only the spaces they had already seen, but her voice carried a tremor that Inspector Walsh noticed immediately. Walsh had conducted hundreds of tenement inspections and had developed an instinct for detecting deception and concealment. "Ma'am, are there any other rooms down here?" Walsh asked directly. "Storage areas, utility spaces, or chambers that we haven't seen?" "No, this is everything," Bridget replied, but her body language contradicted her words. She stood positioned between the inspectors and the far wall of the basement, subtly blocking their movement in that direction. Her hands trembled slightly as she gestured, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. When Hayes asked to see building blueprints that might indicate additional rooms, Bridget claimed that no such documents existed. This explanation was suspicious because most buildings of this type and age had architectural drawings filed with city records, especially structures that had been converted from private residences to boarding houses. The critical moment came when Clark Chen, while measuring wall dimensions, discovered that the basement's interior measurements didn't match the building's exterior dimensions. His calculations indicated that approximately 12 feet of space was unaccounted for, suggesting the existence of hidden rooms or storage areas. Chen was methodical in his measurements, using a surveyor's chain to establish precise dimensions. He measured the basement's length, width, and the thickness of visible walls, then compared these figures to the building's external footprint. The discrepancy was significant and couldn't be explained by normal structural variations. "Ma'am, we need to locate and examine any additional basement spaces," Inspector Walsh stated firmly. City health codes require inspection of all areas where materials might be stored or where conditions could affect tenant safety. Bridget's demeanor shifted from nervous cooperation to barely controlled panic. She began insisting that the measurements were wrong, that the building had irregular construction that created optical illusions, that the inspectors were wasting their time looking for spaces that didn't exist. Her protests became increasingly frantic and less coherent. She spoke rapidly about previous inspections that had found no problems, about her reputation in the community, about her dedication to providing safe housing for immigrants. The more she talked, the more convinced the inspectors became that she was hiding something significant. As the three officials began systematically examining the basement walls, looking for hidden doors or concealed openings, Seamus appeared at the top of the basement stairs. The boy had been listening to the conversation from his usual hiding place, and something about the tone of the adults' voices had drawn him into the open. Seamus understood that his mother was afraid of these strangers in a way that was different from her usual calculated caution. He had watched her prepare for their visit, seen her clean and organize with desperate intensity, and observed her practicing explanations in front of mirrors. Now he could hear the fear in her voice and see the tension in her posture. Bridget saw her son and immediately tried to send him back upstairs. But Seamus remained frozen on the staircase, staring at the inspectors with his dark, intelligent eyes. For nearly 7 years, he had observed adults without speaking, learning to read their intentions and emotions through careful observation. What Seamus saw in the three inspectors was different from anything he had experienced before. These adults carried themselves with authority, but it was official authority rather than the predatory calculation he had learned to recognize in his mother's victims. They were asking questions that his mother didn't want to answer, searching for things she didn't want them to find. Dr. Hayes noticed the boy's presence and was immediately struck by his unusual demeanor. Seamus stood perfectly still, making no sound, but his eyes showed intelligence and awareness that seemed far beyond his apparent age. There was something haunting about the child's expression, a quality that reminded Hayes of patients he had treated who had witnessed traumatic events. "Is this your son?" Hayes asked Bridget gently. "Yes, but he's not well," Bridget replied quickly. "He doesn't speak. He's been that way since his father died. Please don't mind him." Inspector Walsh studied the boy with professional interest. In her work, inspecting tenement conditions, she had encountered many children affected by poverty, disease, and family trauma. Seamus O'Sullivan showed signs of severe psychological distress, but there was also something alert and observant about him that suggested hidden depths. For the first time in his life, Seamus recognized adults who might have the power to stop what his mother was doing. Dr. Hayes discovered the concealed door behind the furnace at 10:47 a.m. The entrance was cleverly hidden, designed to appear as part of the heating system's infrastructure. But Hayes's medical training had taught him to look for spaces where disease might flourish undetected. When he found the door and opened it, the chemical smell that had been bothering him became overwhelming. The sub-basement revealed itself as a carefully organized charnel house. 7 bodies lay wrapped in sheets and covered with lime, arranged in neat rows along the stone walls. The preservation methods had been effective enough to prevent complete decomposition, leaving the victims recognizable despite their extended storage. Hayes stepped back from the doorway, his medical composure shaken by the scope of what he was seeing. In his years of practice, He had examined countless bodies and investigated numerous suspicious deaths, but he had never encountered evidence of such systematic, methodical murder. Inspector Walsh pushed past Hayes to see into the hidden room, then immediately stepped back, her face pale with shock. She had investigated industrial accidents, building collapses, and disease outbreaks that claimed multiple lives, but those deaths had been accidental or natural. What lay before them was deliberate, calculated slaughter. Clark Chen, trained to document everything he observed, found himself unable to write as he stared into the sub-basement. His hands shook as he tried to record what he was seeing, the precise, bureaucratic language he used for official reports seeming inadequate to describe such horror. The bodies were arranged with disturbing orderliness. Each victim was wrapped in clean white sheets, positioned carefully to maximize space while preventing contact between corpses. Small cloth bags beside each body contained personal belongings, pocket watches, coins, letters, and other items that represented their owners' hopes for success in America. Inspector Walsh immediately ordered Clark Chen to summon police, while Dr. Hayes began examining the bodies to determine cause of death. The scene was so methodically organized that it clearly represented deliberate murder rather than accidental death or disease-related casualties. Hayes's preliminary examination revealed that the victims had died in similar circumstances. Their facial expressions showed signs of severe pain and distress consistent with poisoning. Their bodies showed no external injuries, suggesting that they had been killed through chemical means rather than violence. As the adults moved between shock and professional duty, trying to process what they had discovered, Seamus stood on the basement stairs and finally found his voice. "She hides 7 dead men in our house," he said, his words cutting through the chaos with perfect clarity. "She makes them drink poison tea, and then she takes their money and puts them down there." The silence that followed was absolute. 3 seasoned officials, accustomed to the worst conditions urban poverty could create, found themselves staring at a 7-year-old boy who had just confessed to witnessing multiple murders committed by his own mother. Dr. Hayes was the first to respond, his medical training helping him maintain composure in crisis situations. He approached Seamus carefully, recognizing that the boy had just experienced a psychological breakthrough that could be either therapeutic or traumatic. "Can you tell us more about what you've seen?" Hayes asked gently, using the tone he employed with patients who had suffered severe trauma. Seamus looked at each of the 3 adults, then began speaking in a voice that grew stronger with each word. His sentences came in careful, measured phrases, as if he had rehearsed them during his years of silence. The first man was Paddy Flanagan. He came from Ireland and had gold coins in his pocket. Mama gave him tea that made him sick and then he died. She put him down there. Seamus pointed toward the sub-basement. Then came Klaus Weber. He made clocks and had money sewn in his coat. Mama gave him the same tea. Inspector Walsh listened with growing amazement as the boy continued his account. His descriptions were detailed and consistent, providing names, physical descriptions, and specific details about each victim's possessions and circumstances of death. Heinrich Müller came next. He was a carpenter with gold pieces. Then Antonio Benedetto, who sold his vineyard to come to America. James Crawford from Scotland, Eric Lindqvist from Sweden, and Michael Donovan from County Mayo. They all had money and they all died after drinking Mama's tea. Bridget's reaction was immediate and desperate. She lunged toward Seamus, screaming that he was lying, that he was sick, that he didn't understand what he was saying. Her composure disappeared entirely as she alternated between denying the accusations and trying to physically silence her son. "He's never spoken before," she cried to the inspectors. "He doesn't know what he's saying. He's been traumatized since his father died. He makes up stories. You can't believe him." But Seamus continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as words poured out after years of silence. He described each murder in detail. The victims' names, how they died, where his mother hid their belongings, and how she had disposed of their bodies. His account was so precise and comprehensive that it could only have come from direct observation. "She puts powder in their tea. Seamus explained. "White powder that she keeps in a tin box under her bed. She waits until they're very sick, and then she gives them the tea and tells them it will make them better. But it makes them die instead." Dr. Hayes, trained in both medicine and human psychology, recognized immediately that the boy was describing genuine experiences rather than fabricated stories. The level of detail, the emotional consistency, and the technical accuracy of his descriptions indicated traumatic memory rather than childhood fantasy. The boy's account also explained several mysteries that had puzzled the inspectors. The chemical smell in the basement was arsenic and lime, used for preservation. The missing space was the sub-basement where bodies were stored. The unusual death rate in the boarding house reflected systematic murder rather than natural causes. Inspector Walsh began asking Seamus specific questions to verify his testimony. "Where does your mother keep the powder?" "Under her bed, in a tin box with flowers painted on it. She also has their money there, and their watches, and letters they wrote but never sent." "How long has this been happening?" "Since we came to live here. The first man died when the leaves were falling. The last man died when it was very cold outside." Each answer provided additional details that could be verified through investigation. Seamus described the victims' clothing, their accents, their plans for the future, and their final words before drinking the poisoned tea. His testimony painted a picture of systematic murder, motivated by greed and justified by desperation. Police arrived within 20 minutes, but by then Seamus had provided enough information to establish a clear pattern of premeditated murder. Bridget O'Sullivan was arrested while still screaming that her son was lying, that the bodies in the basement belonged to strangers, that she was being framed by enemies in the Irish community. As officers placed shackles on her wrists, Bridget made one final attempt to discredit Seamus's testimony. "He's been silent for 7 years," she shouted to anyone who would listen. "Silent. He never spoke a word until today. How can you believe a child who's clearly touched in the head?" But her protests only served to make Seamus's breakthrough more remarkable. Dr. Hayes explained to the arriving detectives that traumatic mutism was a recognized medical condition, and that sudden recovery of speech often occurred when psychological pressure reached unbearable levels. "The boy has been carrying these secrets for years," Hayes told Detective Captain William Murphy, who had assumed command of the crime scene. "His silence wasn't a deficiency but a response to trauma. When he finally felt safe enough to speak, everything came out at once." Detective Murphy, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience, immediately recognized the significance of Seamus's testimony. Child witnesses were often unreliable, but this case was different. The boy's account was detailed, consistent, and corroborated by physical evidence that the adults had already discovered. As Bridget was led away, she continued proclaiming her innocence and demanding that no one believe her son's fantasies. But her protests became less credible as investigators began finding evidence that supported every detail of Seamus's testimony. The investigation that followed Seamus O'Sullivan's revelation became one of the most sensational criminal cases in New York City's history. Police discovered not only the 7 bodies in the sub-basement, but also detailed evidence of Bridget's systematic approach to murder and theft. Detective Captain Murphy assembled a team of 12 investigators to examine every aspect of the case. They interviewed neighbors, fellow immigrants, shopkeepers, and anyone who had interacted with Bridget O'Sullivan during her time operating the boarding house. The scope of the investigation revealed a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. Hidden in Bridget's room, investigators found nearly $300 in various currencies, personal belongings from all 7 victims, and a meticulously maintained ledger that recorded each man's wealth, health status, and personal connections. The ledger revealed that Bridget had been evaluating potential victims for months before acting, studying their vulnerabilities and calculating the risks of their disappearance. The ledger was written in a mixture of English and Irish Gaelic, with coded symbols that investigators eventually decoded with help from Irish community leaders. Each entry contained detailed observations about potential victims, their health, their financial resources, their social connections, and their likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. One entry about Michael Donovan read, "Strong constitution, may require double dose. Carries gold coins worth approximately $150. Meeting relatives in Boston March 1st. Must act before departure. No local connections to investigate disappearance." Another entry described Klaus Weber. Chronic cough worsening. Excellent natural cover for illness. Clockmaking tools worth additional value. Lives alone. No family in America. Claims to have work waiting in Pennsylvania, but no specific employer. The level of planning documented in the ledger shocked even experienced investigators. Bridget hadn't been killing impulsively or opportunistically, but had developed a systematic method for identifying, evaluating, and eliminating victims, while minimizing the risk of detection. Thomas Mackenzie, vindicated in his suspicions, provided crucial testimony about Bridget's behavior and the unusual death rate in her boarding house. His informal records, combined with Seamus's eyewitness testimony, established a clear pattern of premeditated murder motivated by financial gain. Mackenzie's testimony revealed that other tenants had also noticed unusual patterns, but had been discouraged from discussing their concerns. Bridget had created an atmosphere where questioning deaths was considered disrespectful to the deceased and disloyal to the Irish community. "She made us feel like suspicious thoughts were a betrayal of our heritage," Mackenzie testified. "She said that in America, we Irish needed to protect each other from outsiders who wanted to blame us for every problem. She made doubt seem like treachery." 18. The toxicology examination revealed that all 7 victims had died from arsenic poisoning, administered in doses carefully calculated to mimic natural illness. Bridget had purchased the poison from multiple suppliers over an 18-month period, claiming she needed it for pest control in her boarding house. Investigators traced her purchases through pharmacy records and chemical supply companies. She had bought arsenic from 7 different vendors, never purchasing large quantities from any single source. She told each supplier that she was battling severe rat infestations in her boarding house, a plausible explanation that raised no suspicions. Dr. Hayes conducted detailed autopsies on all 7 victims, finding evidence of systematic poisoning that demonstrated medical knowledge beyond what most laypeople possessed. The doses had been precisely calculated to cause symptoms that resembled common diseases while ensuring death within predictable timeframes. She understood human physiology well enough to predict how her victims would respond to different amounts of poison. Hayes testified during the trial. "This wasn't random killing but calculated murder based on detailed knowledge of how arsenic affects the human body." The investigation also revealed Bridget's extensive network of contacts within the immigrant community. She had cultivated relationships with undertakers, cemetery workers, and even some clergy members, all of whom had unknowingly assisted her in covering up her crimes. Father Sean O'Brien of St. Patrick's Cathedral testified that Bridget had approached him multiple times requesting prayers for deceased tenants. She had donated money for memorial masses and had presented herself as a devout Catholic woman who cared deeply about proper burial rites for poor immigrants. She seemed genuinely grieved by these deaths, Father O'Brien admitted during his testimony. She spoke about each man as if she had cared for him personally, describing his hopes and dreams for life in America. "I never suspected that she was describing men she had murdered." During her trial, Bridget maintained her innocence while simultaneously presenting herself as a desperate widow, driven to extreme measures by poverty and responsibility to her family. She testified that America had forced her to choose between her son's survival and her moral principles, and that she had chosen her child's life over the lives of strangers. Her defense attorney, Patrick Donnelly, argued that the evidence against his client was circumstantial and that Seamus's testimony was unreliable due to his psychological condition. Donnelly claimed that the boy had constructed elaborate fantasies to explain traumatic experiences he couldn't understand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Donnelly argued, "we are asked to convict a mother based on the word of a child who has been silent for 7 years, who has clearly suffered severe mental trauma, and who may be unable to distinguish between reality and imagination. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney William Harrison, presented overwhelming evidence that corroborated every detail of Seamus's testimony. The ledger, the poison purchases, the victims' belongings, and the bodies themselves all supported the boy's account of systematic murder. Harrison's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. The defense asks you to believe that a 7-year-old boy imagined 7 murders in precise detail, that he somehow learned the names of men he never met, that he invented descriptions of belongings he never saw, and that he fabricated a story that happens to match physical evidence discovered independently by trained investigators. The prosecution asks you to believe the simpler explanation, that this boy witnessed exactly what he described. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 7 counts of first-degree murder. Bridget O'Sullivan was sentenced to death, making her one of the first women executed for multiple murders in New York State history. The sentencing hearing revealed additional details about Bridget's motivations and psychological state. Dr. Hayes testified that she showed signs of moral dissociation, a condition where individuals convince themselves that immoral actions are justified by circumstances. She genuinely believed that her victims were going to die anyway, Hayes explained to the court. In her mind, she was simply accelerating inevitable deaths, while ensuring that their money served a purpose she considered worthy. She had convinced herself that supporting her family in Ireland was more important than extending the lives of strangers who were already sick and vulnerable. Bridget's final statement before sentencing was both defiant and pathetic. She maintained her innocence while acknowledging that she had been forced to make difficult choices to survive in America. "I came to this country with nothing but hope and responsibility," she declared. "America promised opportunity, but provided only struggle. I did what any mother would do to protect her child and support her family. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I accept your judgment, but I do not accept your condemnation." She was hanged at the Tombs prison on September 12, 1881, maintaining her innocence until her final breath. Her last words were reportedly a prayer in Irish Gaelic asking for forgiveness and protection for her son. Seamus O'Sullivan became a ward of the state, eventually placed with St. Joseph's Orphanage in Albany. The Catholic institution specialized in caring for children who had experienced severe trauma, and the nuns there worked patiently to help Seamus recover from his psychological wounds. The trauma of his experiences left him with lasting psychological scars, but his ability to speak, once recovered, never left him again. However, he remained selective about communication, speaking only when necessary and showing a lifelong tendency towards silence and observation. Sister Mary Catherine, who supervised Seamus's care at the orphanage, noted in her records that the boy showed remarkable intelligence and empathy despite his traumatic background. "He understands suffering in a way that most children never will," she wrote. "This knowledge makes him both wise and sad beyond his years." Seamus excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science, subjects that appealed to his methodical mind and need for logical explanations. He also showed artistic talent, creating detailed drawings that helped him process his memories and emotions without needing to verbalize his experiences. At 18, Seamus left the orphanage to apprentice with a master carpenter in Albany. The work appealed to him because it required precision, patience, and the transformation of raw materials into useful objects. He found therapeutic value in creating things that would last, in contrast to the destruction he had witnessed as a child. He grew up to become a highly skilled craftsman, eventually establishing his own carpentry business that specialized in building homes for immigrant families. His work was known for its exceptional quality and attention to detail, characteristics that reflected his perfectionist nature and his understanding of how important safe, secure housing could be for vulnerable people. In 1891, at age 27, Seamus married Catherine Flynn, a schoolteacher from Albany who worked with immigrant children. Catherine had been drawn to Seamus's quiet strength and his obvious empathy for people who had experienced trauma and displacement. Their courtship was slow and careful, with Seamus gradually revealing details of his background as he learned to trust Catherine's gentle nature and non-judgmental attitude. She became the first person to whom he told the complete story of his childhood experiences, and her acceptance and understanding helped him continue his psychological healing. Seamus and Catherine raised 4 children together: Michael, born in 1892, Bridget, born in 1894, Patrick, born in 1897, and Mary, born in 1900. The decision to name their daughter Bridget was deliberate and healing, representing Seamus's determination to reclaim positive associations with his mother's name. Throughout his adult life, Seamus rarely spoke about his childhood experiences, but those who knew him well noticed his compulsive honesty and his inability to tolerate any form of deception. He taught his children to value truth above politeness and to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing, even when silence would be easier. His parenting style was protective but not overprotective. He wanted his children to feel safe while learning to recognize and respond to genuine dangers. He taught them to trust their instincts about people and situations, explaining that children often perceive threats that adults miss or ignore. Seamus also became quietly involved in organizations that assisted immigrants and orphaned children. He donated money to St. Joseph's Orphanage throughout his life and occasionally spoke with other trauma survivors, though he never discussed his experiences publicly. He died in 1943 at the age of 69, taking most of his memories to the grave. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through his work, his kindness, and his quiet example of overcoming profound trauma. Catherine lived until 1951, preserving Seamus's story and ensuring that their children understood their father's remarkable journey from traumatized witness to successful family man. She often told them that their father's greatest achievement wasn't his business success, but his ability to break a cycle of violence and create a loving family despite his horrific childhood. The boarding house at 47 Hester Street was demolished in 1885 as part of urban renewal efforts, but the case of Bridget O'Sullivan remained a cautionary tale in immigrant communities for decades. Her story became a reminder that the desperation of poverty could transform even maternal love into something monstrous, and that the American dream sometimes extracted prices that destroyed the dreamers themselves. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant communities to predators who understood their isolation and desperation. Bridget's victims had died not just from poison, but from their lack of connections and advocates who would have investigated their disappearances. Their deaths revealed the deadly gaps in a society that promised opportunity while providing little protection for those who arrived with nothing but hope. Modern criminologists who study the O'Sullivan case often focus on Seamus's prolonged silence and sudden revelation. His ability to observe and remember details while remaining mute represents one of the most unusual aspects of the case, demonstrating how trauma can both silence and preserve testimony simultaneously. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a psychiatrist who studied the case in 1923, wrote that Seamus's experience illustrated the complex relationship between trauma and memory. The same psychological mechanism that prevented him from speaking also preserved his memories with extraordinary clarity, Stevens observed. His silence wasn't absence but presence. The presence of experiences too overwhelming to vocalize until circumstances made speech both possible and necessary. The case also influenced changes in how authorities investigated deaths in immigrant communities. The New York City Board of Health implemented more systematic record-keeping and cross-referencing procedures designed to identify suspicious patterns of mortality. Police departments began training officers to recognize signs of systematic predation within vulnerable communities, and social workers developed protocols for identifying and protecting individuals who might be targeted by predators who exploited isolation and desperation. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Bridget O'Sullivan's crimes? Or might there have been other victims whose bodies were never found? The desperation of immigrant life in 1881 New York created conditions where such horrors could flourish undetected. Leave your comment below with your thoughts on how desperation can transform ordinary people into monsters. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and we're here to uncover them all. See you in the next video.